You're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, can Russia kick racism out of football? The Russian Football Union has launched a task force to rid racism from the game ahead of the 2018 World Cup, which will be hosted by Russia. These follow a string of recent racial incidents surrounding Russian football. The most notable of which was when a banana was thrown from the crowd at Anzhi Makhachkala's Chris Samba during a game against Lokomotiv Moscow. Zenit St. Petersburg is the only Russian Premier League club to have never fielded a black footballer. At least one professional coach has gone on record saying that the club's fans don't like black players. But last week, Spartak Moscow Football Club announced that it's creating a programme to tackle racism and anti-Semitism in Russian football. However, just a day after, the Russian Football Union's president said that Russia has no club with a racist orientation or that has showed racial intolerance. Now, today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Mortimer, a former top-flight English footballer who now campaigns for the British anti-discrimination charity Show Racism the Red Card. And joining me on the phone is Richard van Poortvliet, a sports reporter for the international broadcaster Russia Today, and Fyodor Turbin, a press manager for Spartak Moscow, and is working on the club's foundation to fight xenophobia, racism and anti-Semitism in Russian football. So, gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I'd first like to ask you all briefly, how big a problem is racism in Russian football at the moment? Richard van Poortvliet.
Yeah, Tim, I think it's a big problem, to be honest, a problem which really hasn't been addressed over the last few years. To be honest, I think it's got slightly better, perhaps over the last year or so, but it still remains a huge problem. I mean, we've seen so many incidents recently. Roberto Carlos having two bananas thrown at him last season in games against Krylia Sovieta and Zenit St. Petersburg, and of course the Chris Samba incident not very long ago when his club was playing Lokomotiv Moscow. I spoke to Samba literally about a couple of weeks before that incident happened, and he was very confident that he wouldn't encounter any racism while he was in Russia. But unfortunately, it only took a couple of weeks for the worst to happen to him, really. And it's really up to the authorities. For instance, with the two Roberto Carlos incidents, the police and the stadium authorities have managed to identify those responsible. But unfortunately, there's no code within the Russian system to deal with supporters like this. There's no fines, nothing like which would happen in the UK, where if someone was guilty of racist abuse, they would be fined and might even get a prison sentence, like the guy who wrote on Twitter those dreadful things about Fabrice Mwamba. Unfortunately, just nothing exists like this in Russia until there are more heavy penalties. Unfortunately, I can see racism persisting in Russia.
And Fyodor Turbin from Spartak Moscow, how big a problem is racism in Russian football at the moment?
Yes, I quite agree with Richard. It's a big problem, and it's probably recently it has been growing. There's no thing like a law, a special law, to give the racist abusers to a prison sentence or something like that. It's only fines, and as long as that, it's only the fines. I think the system is not working quite properly. The Spartak owner, the vice president of Lukoil oil company, Leonid Fedun, created a foundation to try to drag audience attention to the problem. Like during the last match with Kuban, last fixture, Spartak fixture in Premier League, the team entered the pitch with no racism shirts on them. The announcer just on the stadium tried to drag the attention of the audience, and I think it's the first step to drag the audience attention to that problem.
And Paul Mortimer?
In doing this, in being invited here, I did a little bit of research, and from what I've seen, it is a huge problem. And the profile, there isn't much of a profile for it. You have to actually search for it on the internet. Now, I saw a couple of things that, the Roberto Carlos incident, when that came out, I was just searching the internet for things and came across it. and couldn't believe it was a couple of weeks running, I think, and he walked off the pitch. You really had to search for it to see it was there. Now, the Chris Samba thing, it really isn't a surprise. It's there, but again, the problem is that racism isn't really understood. The understanding of what racism is, of why it happens and why it's unacceptable, really isn't really understood in parts of Russia. How offensive it is, and how to deal with it. Like you said, there is nothing in place to deal with fans who are racist or who abuse people. And with the World Cup coming, it'd be quicker than you think. There's going to be a lot of people of colour coming, not just players but supporters, officials. It's going to be totally unacceptable. Now, what they need to do is they need to get in touch with FIFA. Then help is needed. Help is needed to educate people so they understand exactly why this is unacceptable and why it's got to stop.
And Richard, I'd like to bring you in here. I mean, given that Russia will host the World Cup in 2018, will this put fans off from travelling to the venues in Russia?
Well, I could completely understand why it would put them off, given what's been reported and what actually happens. Unfortunately, Paul absolutely hit the nail on the head. There's just not an understanding of how offensive racism is, I think, and it's a very in-rooted problem. It's Russia. The current situation in Russia is almost like the 70s and early 80s in the UK, where no one actually thought about how offensive racism actually is. The UK has made absolutely wonderful strides in trying to tackle this problem, and there's a lot that Russia can learn, really. Unfortunately, it's about educating the youth, because the youth, the children, the teenagers who go to games at the moment in Russia, they copy what people from the older generations do, because they just think this is the norm. And it's really, I think the Russian Football Union, the Russian Premier League, really need to make much greater steps, perhaps involving players who the fans respect, to try and actually get the message home that racism is not acceptable. Because at the moment, it's something that everyone thinks of as a everyday way of life. To be honest, they just don't have any idea of the consequences of how hurtful and how offensive racism can be. So at the moment, yes, I can certainly. Russia doesn't have the greatest image in the West anyway, but certainly in terms of racism, and racism does exist in Russia and Russian football, but it could certainly put off a lot of people from going to the World Cup.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. Paul, I'd like to ask you now. I mean, you represent Show Racism, the Red Card. It's been around for a good few years now, as has other organisations like Kick It Out and the Fair Network as well. And what has it done to tackle discrimination?
Well, I'll tell you what we do. We're an educational charity. So basically, what we don't condemn people. We try to educate people. We try to work out, well, where do we go from here? And that's what we try to do. We try to, we go into schools. I'm an educator. I go into schools, and like your man said, it's the kids. You do need to go and educate the children, because the adults are from a different era, and I can just imagine in Russia, the era the parents are from, will probably not have come across many people of colour, of different colours. So when that happens, there is a fear, because you just don't know. They'll see people that look different, and we're always a little bit frightened of things that are different, and we start to treat things a certain way. Now, if we can educate our kids to understand that, the colour of the skin may be different, but that person inside is the exact same. And that's what we try to do at Show Racism, the Red Card. We don't condemn, we try to educate people, and we try to raise the profile and the awareness of what racism is, of how it affects people, and the fact that it's illegal.
Richard, Russia is such a huge country full of diversity. I mean, is it possible that it's just impossible to envisage the Russian Premier League as racism-free? Is it an uphill struggle?
Of course, it's going to be an uphill struggle, but I think during the 70s and early 80s, I think if you said, could you imagine the first division in England being racism-free, I think people would have sort of looked at you quite strangely, because it was such a part and parcel of the game, and you'd get home players of your team being booed by your home supporters just because of the skin of their colour. Coloured pioneers of the game, sort of from the Afro-Caribbean countries, and people like Viv Anderson, for instance, they were booed. And you couldn't just not have imagined that the UK would have come so far in the space of such a short time, in the space of quarter of a century. Of course, Russia is going to take a very long time, and there needs to be education within Russia to try and teach the youngsters, and even perhaps try and get through to some of the older generation about how racism it is wrong. And in no way am I trying to defend racism, but Russia is a very young country. It's only 20 years old since the breakup of the Soviet Union. For instance, during the Soviet Union, there were a lot of African students, Caribbean students, Asian students who came into Moscow to study at the universities because they offered very high quality and free education, and they were loved by the local population. It was really just since the breakup of the Soviet Union that black people, Caribbean people, Asian people have been victimized, and really that's applied because of the poverty which went on during the 90s. They were a very easy target. People would associate people from ethnic minorities as being involved in drugs and crime, and it's basically they were an easy target. It's trying to re-educate the fact that no, they're not. These are not people who are responsible for this, and it's trying to tackle this problem of racism. And I think it would be a fantastic idea if they could get the likes of, say, top players in Russia like Andrei Arshavin or Roman Pavlyuchenko to go into the schools, to go into sports clubs and just teach the children that racism is wrong, because they're not going to listen to some policeman or counsellor from a football club, but they're going to listen to people who they respect, top football players.
Paul Mortimer, you're nodding your head.
Yes, I am. Richard is absolutely spot on. He is right. It is a young country, and with a lot to learn and a lot of time to do it. And I agree. The footballers should be used. The top footballers should be used because they are the biggest draw. They are without doubt the biggest draw, and if we could get footballers on board, which is what we do in our country at Show Racism and Red Card, we've got a lot of professional footballers and all the Premiership teams on board. We've been to all the clubs and held events at the clubs, and that draws the local authorities in as well as the players, and the kids get a chance to interact with the players. And the educational message is sent, and from that, that little seed planted, it does grow. It really does, and you have to remember that everyone comes from a community somewhere. So going into the communities also is hugely important. Into youth clubs, into after school clubs, not just into schools. Into anywhere that we can go. And we're only, we're 15. We're into our 16th year, and we're growing every week. But this is what we understand how important this is, and for Russia to grow, and for this to stop in Russia, it does need to start. And it sounds like little steps are being taken to make that happen, which I think it can only be add value.
I think especially in the past few weeks, it does really seem like steps are being taken. We're going into kind of second gear maybe, which brings me on to Fyodor Turbin from Spartak Moscow. Could you tell me a little bit more about this anti-discrimination foundation that Spartak Moscow has set up in the past week?
The foundation probably should. It is the first. It's first foundation of its kind that's found in Russia, and it's only has been found. It's a newborn one because it has been found just a couple of weeks ago. Our aim is to apply to all the people and to probably to show that everybody is alike. And mankind probably had much bigger problems than finding differences and abusing each other. So as long as racism should be kicked out of football, as long as it's getting so much attention during the football matches, because the newspapers write about it, and it means that when the abusers are acting on tribunes, on stands, they're probably reaching their goals. So we should just stand up against it, and the foundation. We have speakers like Emmanuel Imenika. He is a speaker of that foundation. He's a football player from Nigeria, and yes, I think the team is up against any kind of racism. So yeah.
Will you be going into schools and educating children in schools? Can you give us? I know it's very early days, but can you give us a bit more detail as to exactly what Spartak will be doing to tackle racism and xenophobia on the football pitch?
We have a young football player in our academy who is father from Africa, and he will be the speaker as well. He will be the youth generation of Spartak young football players who thinks himself as a Russian. Just to show his example will show that there's no difference between European guys and people from Africa. And I think, yes, we should be going to schools, should create some problems. I think we should do this starting from our academy, probably going to schools.
Richard, I'd like to bring you in. What's the reaction in Russia to this foundation that Spartak have set up? Does it mark a turning point?
Well, I think it's a fantastic move. To be honest, I haven't really heard too much about it, but I think that's part of a problem, that things like racism aren't really initiatives to tackle racism really aren't being advertised. I'm sure Spartak have done their best to try and advertise it. Like Fyodor was saying, how players walked out in T-shirts before a game with Kuban. But unfortunately, I mean, it receives very little coverage in the press. I think one staggering example for me was with the Chris Samba incident, when he had a banana thrown at him at the Lokomotiv match. The fact that you could hardly read about it anywhere in the Russian press, or it was in very small print, but or in a very small sections dug somewhere in the newspaper. But whereas if you turn on the BBC website, front page on the sports headlines, the fact that Chris Samba's had a banana thrown in, and that's part of a problem in a way in Russia. The fact that the press really aren't taking this seriously. I mean, Lokomotiv's, for instance, their stance on that incident was just laughable. Really, how they said that no banana was thrown at all. Had they just held their hands up and said, "Yes, I'm sorry, one of our fans threw this banana. We're working on the problem. We're trying to find the supporter responsible. He will be banned," they would just look so much better. And this is an issue which is really harming Russia's image abroad. I mean, Russians are very proud of the fact that they're Russian, but unfortunately, all these racist incidents are causing the country no end of harm in terms of PR. Because I mean, Russia's getting a really bad image, really, from around the world.
Paul Mortimer, is it an issue of getting the press on side as well then?
Yeah, I think the biggest single factor, the biggest leap, is to accept that there's a problem. From what Richard said, it's not accepted yet, and therein lies the very first problem. There is an issue, without a doubt, and until the press accept there is an issue and start to raise the profile, it's not going to be dealt with properly, because it is so easy, if you get the press on board, to be able to find avenues to deal with it, because then it's accepted that it is a problem. Now, at the moment, the way it's viewed, and listening to this tells me that it's there. And in some quarters, it is. There's without a doubt, as Richard was saying on the BBC website. I looked on the BBC website, and it also said that the head of Russian football said that there's no problems with racism with any Russian club. If that's the head of Russian football saying that, every single club will have to adhere to that. It's brave of Spartak Moscow, of course it is. But if the head is saying, well, we haven't really got a problem, then that kind of tells you what you're actually fighting against, and until it's accepted that, let's be honest, these things have happened, they've created an issue, what are we going to do to deal with them? Until that starts, everything I think that comes from that is going to be difficult. It's never going to get the publicity it should do. There will be certain people who will fight for it, but until if the press agree with the head of Russian football, you've got no chance. Because there is a nil acceptance that something's happened. Now, accept something's happened, then you can seek advice, because it shouldn't be Spartak Moscow. It should be the Football Federation that deal with it. Now, it is a huge contradiction when the head of football says there's no problem, and Spartak Moscow is saying, well, hold on a sec, we see it and we're going to deal with it. And at least one club has had the guts to stand up and say, hold on, there is a problem, and let's hope that all the other clubs stand up and start accepting that there is an issue. It's to say, well, what do we do about it? Because a lot of the time, it's just about education. Yes, the economics and things like that do come into it, the financial aspects in countries, yes, but a lot of it, again, it is down to a lack of education. And until people are aware of it, understand it, recognise it, then it's never going to stop.
Well, we've heard. I mean, there have been mixed messages. I mean, you're referring to Sergei Furzenko's comments that none of the country's clubs have a problem with racism, but I believe one of the other members of the Russian Football Union also said that with the World Cup coming, we really need to tackle it, grab the ball by the horns, and there's been this task force which has been set up to really tackle racism. Richard, why are there these such mixed messages from senior figures about tackling racism in football?
I think it's just a lack of understanding of a problem, to be honest. I think there's just, as you say, there's a complete mixed message because people have different understandings of a problem. I think people don't really want to sort of tread on other people's toes to a certain extent, so that's why they're saying there's no problem. But clearly there is a problem. It shouldn't really be up to Spartak Moscow. It should be up to the federation to try and implement something, and starting with stiffer penalties. Who could have thought, say, 25 years ago, that if you, I'm just talking about the student who wrote about the racist tweet against Fabrice Mwamba, who could have thought 25 years ago that this person would end up in jail for what he wrote? And I think that is absolutely fantastic because it's a wonderful deterrent. And really, it should be the Russian Football Union and the Russian Premier League should be looking to implement similar legislation to ban people, to give them very, very big fines for any racist chanting or, for instance, of throwing bananas, because that's the only way to get through to the fans, to try and educate them, to try and stop. I mean, a stadium announcer can say 200 times, do not throw bananas or stop racist chanting, but no one's going to listen because people will only learn once they've been hit in the pocket. It sounds very draconian. Russia, in a way, is different. I mean, that's how people will learn.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, can Russia kick racism out of football? Now, Paul Mortimer, you've had a very, glittering career in football. Did you ever encounter racism as a black footballer in England?
Yeah, definitely. I listened to Richard talking about what happened in the 70s. I started playing in the late 80s, and it was rife in the late 80s. I suffered abuse throughout my career. And there's a change in face to it. I mean, when I was a younger player, it wasn't just bananas thrown, by the way. There were coins and batteries and Coke cans and stones and sticks and anything people could get their hands on, they threw. And, the abuse you got was terrible. It really was. And if you can imagine, I know there's been times where I've been the only black player on the pitch. So every time I touch the ball, there would be booing and all of that. And, my teammates didn't really know how to deal with it, and neither did the opposition. Because a bit like what's happening in Russia now, there was no real understanding of how to deal with it, of what to do, because people had never come across it before. But as time went on, and what's happened in England, which is what is going to happen in Russia, if you look at all the players that are going over to Russia at the moment, a lot of the top players are of a colour. So, and that's what happened. What started to happen in England was prominent players were of colour and started to speak out against it. Now, that's what's happening. Chris Sambler's come along and is speaking out against it. Now, that will only raise the profile, which is what you want. And, what happened in England was the one thing people didn't want to be called was a racist. They didn't want to be called that. Have that levelled at them. They didn't want to be called that. So there was two things to do. And the first thing, the most important thing, was to actually accept there's an issue and actually deal with it. Now, that happens. Also, there are people who, think that certain way but keep it quiet, which is not very good. But while this ball rolls forward of dealing with racism in this country, we have a better chance of educating everyone. Now, what hopefully will happen, I mean, the World Cup coming to Russia has done them a huge favour because they have to do something about it. It has to be done because, what you wouldn't want is a team walking off the pitch because of that abuse. And that's coming. Believe me, I believe that will come. A team will say, sorry, until people behave, we're not coming on the pitch, which I think is right. I just do not think that people should be able to abuse people because their skin colour is different. Call them rubbish footballers. As a player, I'm there to be criticised, not a problem. But it's got nothing to do with the colour of my skin. And until people understand that, I worry about what could happen during the World Cup. They've got a bit of time, and let's hope that the federation come to their senses and listen to clubs like Spartak Moscow and the Moscow owner, because he knows, it sounds like he understands what's required and knows that there's a problem and is putting himself out there to try and do something about it.
Okay, so we're running out of time now. Very briefly, I'd like to ask you your final thoughts. You know, what needs to be done to kick racism out of football in Russia? So, Fyodor.
The first thing is to drag people's attention to it, that it is offensive and it is a huge problem. Because some people just don't take it too seriously. Every sport like match, there will be a home game. There will be activities, anti-racism activities at every sport like home game involving football players as speakers and probably education in school. And after that, as the attention, the public attention is drawn, and probably some changes in people's minds are made. After that, there will be adequate reaction from authorities, from Premier League, from the football union, and the ultimate goal will be changing people's minds until the World Cup. Yes.
Richard, what needs to be done?
You need better coverage in the press and the media. You really need to get the clubs and the press involved together to try and promote this. But also, I think if nothing else works, you've got to try and sort of get through to the supporters. But this is really, really damaging Russia's image. Russia, as I said before, I mean, Russians are incredibly proud about their country. They love their country. They're extremely proud about it. But the thing is, I mean, Russia's image is really, really being damaged. Every single story that happens where a racist incident is involved just makes people question more. Why was the World Cup given to Russia in 2018? In a way, I think 2018 the World Cup being given to Russia could act as a catalyst. And really, I really hope that this can be the spark to really try and have a massive drive to get to kick racism out of football in Russia. But unfortunately, at the moment, Russia's image is really, really being damaged. And I think a lot of these supporters who are doing chanting these racist chants and throwing bananas don't actually think about this, how much damage they're doing to the image.
Paul?
Well, I think that, the federation and the clubs have to get it right first time. So what they need to do, in my opinion, is seek help. Is go and do some research. Go and come to England and see how it's done. Here. We may not have it 100% perfect. I think we're ahead of the game. I think compared to a lot of clubs in Europe. In Russia, I think what they've got to do is go and seek advice. Go and actually find out. Come to England and find out how it works, because it is something sometimes you need help with. Because there's a lot of people who don't understand what racism is. So you need to come out of Russia, go and see how it's done somewhere else. What kind of strategies are put in place to deal with things like this, because it's very difficult sometimes to come up with strategies when you really don't understand the topic. See, racism is a topic that divides a lot, and a lot of people shy away from it, and a lot of people think they know what it is and don't. So it's important that that the understanding, the clear definition of racism is there for everyone to understand, and that there's an acceptance that something is happening, and go and ask advice, go and seek advice, go and research from people that have been in your situation, like we were in this country, like you say, Richard, in the 70s, and how have we got to where we are now?
Well, unfortunately, we have to finish there, but just to remind you, you're listening to The Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I've been asking, can Russia kick racism out of football? Now, joining me in this discussion in the studio was Paul Mortimer, a former top-flight English footballer who now campaigns for the British anti-discrimination charity Show Racism the Red Card. And joining me on the phone was Richard Van Portfleet, sports reporter for the international broadcaster Russia Today, and Fyodor Turbin, the press manager for Spartak Moscow Football Club, and is working on the club's programme to fight xenophobia, racism and anti-Semitism in Russian football. Stay tuned, the news is up next.
Slightly better, perhaps over the last year or so, but it still remains a huge problem. I mean, we've seen so many incidents recently. Roberto Carlos having 2 bananas thrown at him last season in games against Krylia Sovieta and Zenit St. Petersburg, and of course the Chris Samba incident not very long ago when his club was playing Lokomotiv Moscow. I spoke to Samba literally about a couple of weeks before that incident happened, and he was very confident that he wouldn't encounter any racism while he was in Russia. But unfortunately, it only took a couple of weeks for the worst to happen to him, really. And it's really up to the authorities. For instance, with the two Roberto Carlos incidents, the police and the stadium authorities have managed to identify those responsible. But unfortunately, there's no code within the Russian system.
Was thrown from the crowd at Anzhi Makhachkala's Chris Samba during a game against Lokomotiv Moscow. Zenit St. Petersburg is the only Russian Premier League club to have never fielded a black footballer. At least one professional coach has gone on record saying that the club's fans don't like black players. But last week, Spartak Moscow Football Club announced that it's creating a programme to tackle racism and anti-Semitism in Russian football. However, just a day after, the Russian Football Union's president said that Russia has no club with a racist orientation or that has showed racial intolerance. Now, today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Mortimer, a former top-flight English footballer who now... You're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, can Russia kick racism out of football? The Russian Football Union has launched a task force to rid racism from the game ahead of the 2018 World Cup, which will be hosted by Russia. These follow a string of recent racial incidents surrounding Russian football. The most notable of which was when a banana...
To deal with supporters like this, there's no fines, nothing like which would happen in the UK, where if someone was guilty of racist abuse, they would be fined and might even get a prison sentence, like the guy who wrote on Twitter those dreadful things about Fabrice Mwamba. Unfortunately, just nothing exists like this in Russia until there are more heavy penalties. Unfortunately, I can see racism persisting in Russia.
And Fyodor Turbin from Spartak Moscow, how big a problem is racism in Russian football at the moment?
Yes, I quite agree with Richard. It's a big problem, and it's probably recently it has been growing. There's no thing like a law, a special law, to give the racist abusers to...
Now campaigns for the British anti-discrimination charity Show Racism the Red Card. And joining me on the phone is Richard van Poortvliet, a sports reporter for the international broadcaster Russia Today, and Fyodor Turbin, a press manager for Spartak Moscow, and is working on the club's foundation to fight xenophobia, racism and anti-Semitism in Russian football. So, gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I'd first like to ask you all briefly, how big a problem is racism in Russian football at the moment? Richard van Poortvliet.
Yeah, Tim, I think it's a big problem, to be honest, a problem which really hasn't been addressed over the last few years. To be honest, I think